The year was 1943, and the world stood at the edge of a massive turning point. For years, the Axis powers Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan had dominated battlefields across Europe, Africa, and Asia. Their armies had advanced with frightening speed, leaving behind a trail of conquered nations, crushed democracies, and shattered hopes. But by the middle of World War II, the tides of war had begun to shift. The seeds of the Axis downfall were quietly taking root, and soon, the balance of power would start to tilt dramatically against them. The first major crack in the Axis armor appeared in North Africa. The German Afrika Corps, once feared, under the brilliant leadership of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, had been pushed back by the combined force of the British 8th Army and American reinforcements. Battles like El Alamein marked the beginning of the end for the Axis in this region. What had once been a proud and confident military force was now struggling for supplies, reinforcements, and strategic stability. Rommel's retreat signaled more than just the loss of territory. It indicated a weakening Axis ability to sustain long campaigns. Back in Europe, Italy was beginning to crumble from the inside. The Italian population, exhausted by years of war, bombings, and economic collapse, started losing faith in Mussolini's leadership. The once mighty fascist regime was weakening, and whispers of rebellion were starting to rise. Italian soldiers, demoralized and outmatched, could no longer hold the lines they once defended with pride. Allied forces slowly advanced, taking advantage of Italy's fragile state. Soon, what seemed unthinkable happened. Italy's own government turned against Mussolini. The dictator who once dreamed of rebuilding the Roman Empire was arrested, signaling a major blow to the Axis cause. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, Germany faced a nightmare far greater than any other battlefield. The Soviet Union, fueled by unmatched manpower, harsh winters, and an unbreakable will to survive, had begun pushing back the invaders. Stalingrad became the turning point, a brutal, unforgiving clash where German forces were surrounded, starved, and ultimately defeated. The fall of Stalingrad shattered the myth of an invincible German army. It was more than a military loss. It was a psychological blow that echoed across the continent. For the first time, the Allies saw that the Axis could be stopped. In the skies, Allied bombers dominated. Cities like Hamburg and Essen became targets of relentless bombardment. German factories struggled to keep up production. Fuel shortages grew, and thousands of experienced pilots were lost. The mighty Luftwaffe, once a powerful symbol of Hitler's terror, was now fighting desperately just to maintain control of the skies. As the year 1943 progressed, the collapse of the Axis powers began to accelerate. What had started as cracks in their foundation now grew into deep fractures that threatened the very core of their war machine. Nowhere was this clearer than in Italy, where the once firm grip of Benito Mussolini had slipped beyond recovery. After years of defeats, economic exhaustion, and public frustration, Italy found itself drifting toward chaos. The Italian people, who once marched proudly under fascist banners, now questioned why their youth were dying in distant battles and why their cities were being turned into rubble. The Allied invasion of Sicily in July 1943 marked a decisive turning point. Operation Husky, as it was known, was a massive amphibious assault combining American, British, and Canadian forces. The Italians were unprepared for the scale and speed of the attack. German commanders, sensing disaster, quickly realized that Italy could no longer hold the line. As Allied troops advanced, morale in the Italian army collapsed. Soldiers surrendered in large numbers, civilians fled, and the once stable Axis southern front began to dissolve. Within weeks, Sicily fell, and the shockwaves reached Rome. Facing pressure from all sides, Italy's Grand Council finally removed Mussolini from power. The man who had promised glory and empire was arrested and replaced by Marshal Pietro Badoglio, who secretly began negotiating Italy's exit from the war. This betrayal stunned Hitler. Germany had counted on Italy as its major European partner. The fall of Mussolini wasn't just a political change, it was the first major internal collapse within the Axis alliance. To Hitler, This felt like a knife in the back, and it forced him to make hasty, strategic decisions he wasn't prepared for. Determined not to lose Italy, Germany quickly moved troops into the country. What was supposed to be an alliance now turned into an occupation. German soldiers disarmed Italian troops, seized their weapons, and took control of key cities. Italy, once a proud partner of the Axis, now found itself under the authority of its former ally. Mussolini was rescued by German commandos and installed as the leader of a puppet state in northern Italy. But it was too late. The Italians were divided, confused, and unwilling to fight for a cause they no longer believed in. While Italy crumbled, the Eastern Front delivered even greater devastation to Germany. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad had energized the Red Army, and now they launched a series of powerful offensives aimed at reclaiming lost territory. The Battle of Kursk became another decisive blow. It was the largest tank battle in history, where thousands of armored vehicles clashed across vast open fields. Germany had hoped their new Tiger and Panther tanks would regain momentum, but the Soviets were prepared. Minefields, anti-tank artillery, and deep defensive lines stopped the German advance. Cold. By early 1944, the fall of the Axis powers had transformed from a slow crumble into a steady and unstoppable collapse. Germany, once confident in its blitzkrieg tactics, now found itself trapped in a tightening vice. On one side was the advancing Soviet Red Army, pushing relentlessly from the east. On the other, growing Allied pressure from Italy and preparations for a massive assault from the west. Hitler's dream of a 1,000-year Reich was rapidly shrinking into a desperate battle for survival. In Italy, the German army fought fiercely to slow the Allied advance. The rugged Italian terrain, mountains, rivers, and narrow passes became natural obstacles that the Germans used to their advantage. The Gustav Line, a powerful defensive barrier stretching across Italy, was designed to halt the Allies for as long as possible. The town of Cassino became the symbol of this brutal struggle. The Allies launched repeated attacks, but the Germans defended every inch with determination. The fighting was intense, slow, and costly. Entire towns were reduced to rubble, and thousands of soldiers on both sides paid the price. But despite their resistance, the Germans could not hold forever. Allied forces pushed steadily northward, backed by relentless air power and a constant flow of reinforcements. Rome eventually fell in June 1944, marking the first Axis capital captured by the Allies. The loss of Rome was more than a military defeat, it was a symbolic blow that echoed across the Axis world. It showed that even Germany's strongest positions were not unbreakable. While Italy struggled, an even greater storm was forming in Western Europe. For years, Hitler had feared the possibility of an Allied invasion across the English Channel. To prepare, he ordered the building of the Atlantic Wall, a vast network of bunkers, artillery positions, and coastal defenses stretching from France to Norway. But by 1944, Germany no longer had the resources to make the Atlantic Wall the impenetrable fortification he imagined. Many positions were incomplete, undermanned, or lacking proper equipment, yet Hitler believed it would be enough. The Allies, however, had different plans. They prepared for the most ambitious military operation in history, a massive amphibious invasion to open a new front in Europe. The Germans knew an invasion was coming, but they didn't know when or where. The Allies used clever deception operations to mislead German intelligence into believing the main attack would happen in Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. This confusion gave the Allies a critical advantage. As the preparations continued, German troops across France faced growing pressure from the French resistance. Sabotage operations targeted railroads, communication lines, and supply routes. Each act of defiance further weakened the German grip on occupied territories. What was once a tightly controlled Nazi empire was now being shaken from the inside. June 6, 1944. This date would become known as one of the most decisive moments in world history. As dawn approached, thousands of Allied ships gathered across the English Channel. Soldiers from the United States, Britain, Canada, and several other nations prepared for the largest amphibious invasion ever attempted. Their mission was clear: land on the beaches of Normandy, break through the Atlantic Wall, and open a new front that would finally crush Nazi Germany from the west. The Axis powers had no idea that this day would mark the beginning of their irreversible collapse. The Germans, misled by Allied deception, believed the main invasion would strike at Pas de Calais. As a result, many of their strongest divisions and commanders were positioned far from Normandy. When the first Allied paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines in the early hours, confusion spread among German units. Communication lines failed, and reports of enemy landings seemed too scattered to piece together. Hitler himself was asleep, and his staff hesitated to wake him, delaying critical decisions. Every hour lost made Germany's situation worse. When the amphibious landings began, the beaches erupted into chaos. At Omaha Beach, American forces faced brutal resistance. Machine gun fire rained down from fortified bunkers, and many soldiers never made it past the waterline. But despite the carnage, the Allies pushed forward. Inch by inch, they fought their way up the cliffs, destroying defenses, clearing obstacles, and gaining precious ground. On other beaches, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword, the Allied troops advanced faster, overwhelming the scattered German defenders. By the end of D-Day, the Allies had secured a foothold in France. This beachhead, though narrow and fragile, was enough. It marked the beginning of a massive and unstoppable push toward the heart of Europe. German commanders realized that the nightmare they always feared had arrived. A two-front war that would drain them beyond recovery. As the Allies expanded their lines in Normandy, German forces tried desperately to counterattack. One of the most significant attempts came from the fearsome panzer divisions, but the Allies had overwhelming air superiority. Allied fighter planes and bombers dominated the skies, destroying German tanks, supply convoys, and reinforcements before they could reach the battlefield. The Luftwaffe, once a terror of the skies, was now a shadow of its former self. Meanwhile, the French resistance grew bolder. Saboteurs attacked train lines, fuel depots, and communication centers. They guided Allied forces through hidden paths and provided intelligence on German positions. What was once a vast Nazi-occupied Europe was now burning with rebellion. As the Allies advanced through France, another critical event unfolded. In the east, the Soviet Union launched. By late 1944, the Axis powers were collapsing faster than ever before. With France liberated, the Allies pushed relentlessly toward the German border. Cities that had once been symbols of Nazi power were now under threat. Yet Hitler refused to retreat or negotiate. Instead, he clung to the belief that a miracle victory could still turn the war around. This desperation pushed Germany to launch one final, massive counterattack, an operation that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Hitler believed that if he could break through the Allied lines in the Ardennes forest, he could split the American and British forces, capture the port of Antwerp, and force the Allies into a peace agreement. It was a bold gamble, but it came at a time when Germany no longer had the strength or resources to sustain such an offensive. Still, Hitler committed everything he had left: tanks, armored divisions, and elite troops. The attack began on December 16, 1944, under cover of fog and snow, catching the Allies completely off guard. For a moment, it seemed like Germany might succeed. German tanks punched through American lines, capturing towns and creating a deep bulge in the Allied front, giving the battle its name. The surprise was devastating, and many Allied units were overwhelmed. But the Germans were fighting against time. Their fuel supplies were limited, their soldiers exhausted, and the winter conditions brutal. As soon as the weather cleared, Allied air power returned with full force. Planes attacked German tanks, supply trucks, and troop movements, crippling the offensive. One of the most heroic stands of the war occurred in the town of Bastogne, where American forces, surrounded and outnumbered, refused to surrender. When the Germans demanded their capitulation, General Anthony McAuliffe delivered his famous one-word reply: "Nuts." Reinforcements eventually broke through the German lines and relieved Bastogne, turning the tide of the battle. By January 1945, The German offensive had completely collapsed. Hitler's last gamble had failed, leaving Germany weaker than ever. While the Allies pushed from the west, the Soviet Union was preparing a final assault on the east. The Red Army launched its massive Vistula-Oder offensive in January 1945, crushing German forces in Poland and moving dangerously close to Berlin. Cities that the Nazis had occupied for years were retaken in days. German defenses crumbled under the sheer power and momentum of the Soviet advance. The war that Germany had started so confidently was now closing in on the capital itself. Inside Germany, morale collapsed. Bombings devastated major cities like Berlin, Dresden, and Hamburg. Factories were destroyed, transportation networks shattered, and millions of civilians fled westward, seeking safety from the advancing Red Army. The once mighty Third Reich was now a nation in ruins, held together only by Hitler's fanatic determination to fight to the last. By March 1945, Nazi Germany was trapped in a tightening ring of destruction. The Allies had crossed the Rhine River from the west, and the Soviet Red Army was approaching Berlin from the east. German forces, once proud and powerful, were now broken formations of exhausted soldiers, scattered units, and inexperienced recruits. The Third Reich, built on aggression and terror, was collapsing under the weight of its own ambitions. One of the most critical moments came when the Allies captured the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen. This bridge, still standing across the Rhine, offered the Allies an opportunity Hitler believed impossible: the chance to move deep into Germany with speed and momentum. When American troops stormed the bridge and secured it, chaos spread through German command. Hitler furiously blamed his generals, ordering executions and demanding impossible counterattacks. But none of it mattered. The Allies were now on German soil, advancing rapidly toward the heart of the Reich. As the Allies moved eastward, they discovered the full horror of Nazi brutality. Concentration camps, abandoned by fleeing SS guards, revealed scenes of unimaginable suffering. Starving prisoners, mass graves, and destroyed facilities showed the world the darkest reality of Hitler's regime. These discoveries fueled the determination of Allied soldiers. For them, the war was no longer just about defeating Germany, it was about ending a system of cruelty unlike anything the world had witnessed before. While American and British forces liberated Western Germany, the Soviet Union closed in from the east with overwhelming force. The Vistula-Oder offensive had crushed the last remnants of German resistance in Poland and pushed deep into German territory. The Red Army, hardened by years of brutal fighting, now had its eyes fixed on Berlin. Street by street, town by town, Soviet forces battled their way forward, overpowering German defenders and destroying any attempt at organized resistance. Inside Germany, the situation had reached total collapse. Civilians fled in every direction, trying to escape bombings, advancing armies, and the chaos that engulfed their homeland. The Nazi leadership, however, refused to accept reality. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, urged the population to fight to the last man, declaring that surrender was worse than death. The once controlled Nazi state was now filled with panic, confusion, and hopelessness. By April 1945, Berlin was surrounded. The Soviet Red Army launched a massive assault on the capital, beginning one of the most intense urban battles in history. Buildings were blown apart by artillery, streets were filled with rubble, and German defenders, many of them teenagers or old men, fought desperately, but without any chance of victory. Hitler retreated into his bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, issuing commands to non-existent armies and clinging to fantasies of a turnaround that would never come. By late April 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing faster than the Nazi leadership could react. Berlin, once the proud capital of Hitler's empire, had become a city of ruins, smoke, and despair. The Soviet Red Army had broken through the outer defenses and was now pushing into the heart of Berlin. Block by block, German resistance was frantic, often led by untrained boys from the Hitler Youth or elderly men from the Volkssturm. They fought with desperation, but the outcome was already decided. The Red Army was too strong, too experienced, and too determined to stop. Inside the Führerbunker, deep beneath the Reich Chancellery, Hitler faced a reality he could no longer avoid. Reports from the front were disastrous. Entire divisions no longer existed. Ammunition was running out. Commanders refused his orders, or worse, no longer responded. Hitler's once glorified vision of a thousand-year Reich had shrunk to a dark, concrete shelter filled with fear and delusion. Though he continued to command his armies, those armies were nothing more than scattered remnants fighting battles already lost. Above ground, Berlin was experiencing one of the most brutal battles in modern history. Soviet artillery bombarded the city relentlessly, reducing entire neighborhoods to rubble. Buildings burned for days, streets were blocked by collapsed structures, and civilians hid in basements, praying for the nightmare to end. Soviet troops fought from building to building, sometimes advancing only meters at a time. Snipers, machine gun nests, and hastily erected barricades turned the city into a maze of deadly traps. Yet the Red Army pushed forward with unstoppable momentum. On April 25, 1945, American and Soviet forces achieved a symbolic moment when they met at the Elbe River. This handshake between two great armies signaled the near completion of Germany's encirclement. The country that once conquered Europe now found itself squeezed from all sides. With this link-up, Hitler's dream of splitting his enemies had vanished forever. Back in Berlin, the situation grew worse by the hour. Food was scarce, ammunition nearly gone, and morale shattered. Nazi officials argued among themselves, some attempting to flee, others insisting on fighting to the last bullet. Hitler knew the end had arrived, but he refused to surrender. Instead, he chose to remain in the bunker and demanded impossible counterattacks from armies that no longer existed. On April 30, 1945, as Soviet forces closed in on the Reich Chancellery, Hitler made his final decision. After marrying Eva Braun in a brief ceremony, he prepared for the end. In the silence of the bunker's private rooms, Hitler ended his life, bringing a dark chapter of history closer to its. With Berlin fallen and Hitler gone, the final days of Nazi Germany unfolded in chaos and confusion. The remaining German leadership, now under Admiral Karl Dönitz, attempted desperately to delay total surrender. Their goal was not victory. Victory was impossible, but to buy time for as many German civilians and soldiers as possible to flee westward and surrender to the Americans or British, rather than fall into Soviet hands. The fear of Soviet retribution was enormous, fueled by years of brutal fighting and Nazi atrocities committed in the East. Allied forces moved swiftly. British, American, and French armies advanced across the western half of Germany, liberating towns, securing industrial centers, and capturing thousands of German soldiers. Many surrendered without a fight, realizing the war was over and no purpose remained in continuing. The once organized German military was now reduced to scattered pockets of resistance, isolated and unable to communicate with each other. Entire units melted away, abandoning equipment and blending into columns of refugees seeking safety. In the north, British forces captured Hamburg and advanced toward Denmark. In the south, the American 7th Army and French 1st Army marched through Bavaria and Württemberg, eliminating the last remaining German defenses. General Patton's 3rd Army captured key cities with remarkable speed, discovering more concentration camps and forced labor sites as they moved. The horrifying scenes left behind by SS guards shocked even the most battle-hardened soldiers, reinforcing the Allies' resolve to dismantle the regime responsible. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union tightened its control over eastern Germany. Cities like Dresden, Leipzig, and Prague saw fierce fighting as German troops resisted Soviet forces in the hope of surrendering to Western allies instead. But the Red Army, determined to complete its mission, crushed remaining pockets of resistance. Every day brought new surrenders, new retreats, and new confirmations that the war was entering its rapidly fading final moments. Despite the devastation, Dönitz tried to maintain a functioning government in Flensburg, near the Danish border. However, the Allies had no intention of negotiating. Their demand remained unchanged: unconditional surrender. German generals, seeing no alternative, began surrendering their forces independently. On May 4th, German troops in the Netherlands, Denmark, and northwest Germany surrendered to British Field Marshal Montgomery. On May 5, German forces in Bavaria and Austria capitulated to the Americans. As 1944 drew closer to its conclusion, the Axis powers faced a storm they could no longer control. Germany was being squeezed from the east and west, while Japan struggled to hold its collapsing empire in the Pacific. Supplies were low, morale was broken, and the once unstoppable Axis war machine was now fighting only to delay the inevitable. The fall of the Axis was no longer a distant outcome, it was unfolding in real time. In Europe, the Eastern Front had turned into a catastrophe for Germany. The Soviet Red Army, having recovered from the brutal years of early war, now advanced with overwhelming force. Operation Bagration had shattered the German Army Group Center, eliminating hundreds of thousands of soldiers, and exposing Germany's eastern borders. Town after town fell as Soviet tanks roared toward Berlin. German commanders knew the tide had completely turned, yet Hitler refused to accept retreat, issuing delusional orders for counterattacks that were impossible to execute. In the West, a similar collapse was underway. After the success of the D-Day landings, Allied forces liberated France and pushed toward the borders of Germany. The once feared Atlantic Wall had crumbled, and German defenses were stretched too thin to resist. Allied bombers dominated the skies, destroying fuel depots, factories, and transport lines. Without fuel, German tanks became useless. Steel shells, often abandoned on the roadside. Civilians faced starvation and nightly bombings, while German cities turned into ruins. Amid this chaos, Hitler launched one last desperate gamble: the Battle of the Bulge, hoping to split the Allied armies and force negotiations. He sent his remaining reserves into a surprise winter offensive in the Ardennes. For a brief moment, Germany created a bulge in the Allied line, but the attack quickly collapsed. Without fuel, reinforcements, or air support, the offensive became nothing more than a costly final scream of a dying regime. The Allies counterattacked, crushing German forces and opening the final road to the heart of the Reich. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, Japan suffered devastating blows. The loss of Saipan and Guam placed American bombers within striking distance of the Japanese mainland. The capture of the Philippines severed Japan's supply routes, leaving the country isolated and starving. The Imperial Navy, once feared worldwide, had been reduced to a handful of damaged ships and inexperienced pilots. Kamikaze attack signaled Japan's desperation and attempt to inflict fear when conventional war had failed. On land, the U.S. island-hopping strategy closed in on Japan from all sides. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa proved Japan would defend every inch of territory with suicidal determination. But each defeat brought American forces closer. Cities burned under relentless bombing raids, and factories struggled to build even basic weapons. Japan's leaders understood the war was lost. Early 1945, the final chapter of the Axis collapse had begun. Germany and Japan were no longer fighting for victory, they were fighting for survival. The walls were closing in from all directions, and the overwhelming force of the Allied powers left no room for escape. The fall of the Axis was now a matter of time, marked by destruction, desperation, and the unshakable determination of the forces pushing for an end to the war. In Europe, the Soviet Red Army had reached the banks of the Oder River, only a short distance from Berlin. The German capital, once the center of Hitler's Grand Empire, now stood vulnerable and exposed. On the Western Front, the Allies crossed the Rhine after their victory at Remagen, bringing American, British, and French forces deep into Germany. With both fronts rapidly closing in, Germany found itself squeezed into a tightening ring of steel. Fuel shortages, lack of ammunition, and the loss of experienced troops left the German army in complete disarray. What remained were scattered units, many made up of teenagers and old men, forced into battle by a desperate regime. Inside Germany, chaos ruled. Cities lay in ruins from relentless Allied bombings. Civilians fled from the advancing front lines, carrying whatever they could. As news of Soviet victory spread, fear grew among the population. Hitler, hidden inside his bunker beneath the destroyed chancellery, issued impossible orders and blamed his generals for every defeat. Reality had slipped away from him, and the Nazi government was collapsing from within. In April 1945, the Battle of Berlin began. Soviet artillery pounded the city day and night, reducing entire streets to rubble. German defenders fought fiercely, but they were outnumbered, outgunned, and exhausted. House-to-house battles turned the capital into a burning tomb. As the Soviets closed in on the bunker, Hitler realized the end had come. On April 30th, he took his own life, and a few days later, Berlin surrendered. On May 7, Germany signed an unconditional surrender, and on May 8, Victory in Europe Day was declared. The European War was finally over, but in the Pacific, the battle still raged. Japan refused to surrender, even as its cities burned and its navy lay at the bottom of the ocean. The United States captured Iwo Jima and Okinawa. After brutal fighting that cost tens of thousands of lives, these victories placed American forces within striking distance of Japan's home islands. Massive firebombing raids devastated Tokyo and other major cities, leaving millions homeless. Still, Japan's leaders insisted on continuing the war, hoping to inflict enough casualties to force a negotiated peace. The aftermath of Japan's surrender, the world stood at a crossroads. The fall of the Axis was complete, but the scars they left behind would shape global history for generations. The war had shattered continents, toppled empires, and redefined the balance of power. Now, the victors were tasked with the enormous responsibility of rebuilding not just nations, but the entire international order. Part 11 explores the immediate consequences of the Axis defeat and the transformation that followed. Germany, the epicenter of Nazi ambition, was now nothing more than a field of ruins. Entire cities such as Berlin, Dresden, and Hamburg were reduced to rubble. Millions of civilians were homeless and starving. The Allied powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, and France divided Germany into 4 occupation zones. Their goals were clear: demilitarize, denazify, and democratize. The Nazi Party was dissolved completely. War criminals were hunted down and put on trial in the famous Nuremberg trials, where the world saw for the first time that even the most powerful leaders could be held accountable for crimes against humanity. But the division of Germany also sowed the seeds for a new global conflict, the Cold War. The Western Allies and the Soviet Union had fought together to defeat the Axis, but their political ideologies were worlds apart. Tension grew as the Soviets established control over Eastern Europe, creating communist states under their influence. The West responded with containment strategies, marking the beginning of a long struggle between democracy and communism. In Japan, the occupation was led primarily by the United States under General Douglas MacArthur. Unlike Germany, Japan was not divided among multiple powers. Instead, the U.S. initiated sweeping reforms, dismantling the military, drafting a new democratic constitution, expanding civil rights, and rebuilding the economy. Emperor Hirohito remained a symbolic figure, but his political authority was stripped away. Factories were restored, infrastructure rebuilt, and land reforms empowered farmers. Japan, once the spearhead of militarism in Asia, began its transformation into a peaceful, modern nation. Meanwhile, across Asia and Africa, the fall of the Axis accelerated the collapse of old colonial empires. European powers, weakened by years of war, could no longer control distant colonies. Nations such as India, Indonesia, Vietnam, and many others began their struggles for independence. The war had shown the world that imperial domination was no longer acceptable or sustainable. A wave of decolonization swept across the globe, permanently reshaping international politics. The creation of the United Nations in 1945 symbolized humanity's Desire to prevent another global catastrophe. The UN introduced a platform for international cooperation, peacekeeping, and conflict resolution. Though far from perfect, it represented a major step toward global unity after years of brutal war. The fall of the Axis not only ended a catastrophic war, it reshaped humanity's understanding of conflict, power, and responsibility. Part 12 examines the deeper aftermath, how societies healed, how the world changed, and how the memory of the war became a guiding force for future generations. The end of World War II was not just a military victory, it was a turning point that transformed global consciousness. In Europe, families torn apart by war searched desperately for missing loved ones. Refugee camps were filled with millions of people wandering across borders with nothing but memories of destruction. Entire communities had vanished. Some towns had no men left. Others were haunted by the loss of entire Jewish populations wiped out in the Holocaust. As liberation revealed the horrors of concentration camps, the world confronted the unimaginable scale of Nazi atrocities. Survivors who emerged from Auschwitz, Dachau, and other camps carried stories that would forever reshape the understanding of human cruelty. In response, the Allies established new laws to protect human rights and punish crimes against humanity. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, aimed to prevent the repetition of such horrors. For the first time in history, the global community recognized that every human being had inherent dignity and rights that must be protected, regardless of nation or race. Germany faced the difficult task of accepting responsibility. The nation divided into East and West Germany followed different paths. The West embraced democracy and economic recovery through the Marshall Plan, while the East was controlled by the Soviet Union and shaped into a communist state. Families were split by the new borders, and tension between the two German states would later be symbolized by the Berlin Wall. Yet, even in the midst of division, Germany slowly rebuilt itself from the ashes, carrying the weight of history while striving for redemption. Japan also experienced profound change. As cities were rebuilt and industries restored, the society underwent a cultural shift. The new Japanese constitution emphasized peace, declaring that Japan would never again wage war. The nation redirected its energy toward economic growth, technology, and education. In the decades that followed, Japan rose from devastation to become a global leader in innovation and industry. This transformation became one of the most remarkable recoveries of the modern age. Around the world, the war produced new alliances and rivalries. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as superpowers, shaping the new global order. The Cold War began almost immediately, influencing politics, technology, and military strategy for decades. Nations aligned themselves with either capitalism or communism, and the rivalry extended into every corner of the world. Yet despite this new tension, the world remained determined to avoid another global conflict. As the world moved further away from the final shots of 1945, the legacy of the Axis collapse continued to unfold. The war had ended, but its impact flowed into every aspect of global life: politics, society, technology, and culture. Part 13 explores how the world adapted in the late 1940s and early 1950s, carrying the weight of devastation while stepping cautiously into a new era. One of the most significant shifts was the formation of new international alliances. The devastation caused by the Axis powers convinced many nations that collective security was essential. In 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization (NATO) was created, uniting Western nations in a military alliance designed to prevent future aggression. The Soviet Union viewed NATO as a threat and responded with the Warsaw Pact in 1955. This division created a sharp line across Europe, separating democratic Western states from the communist Eastern Bloc. The world had changed. and the seeds planted during the fall of the Axis grew into a new global struggle, the Cold War. Despite rising tensions, the post-war world saw remarkable economic recovery. In Western Europe, the Marshall Plan injected billions of dollars into rebuilding industries, transportation, and infrastructure. War-torn nations began to flourish again, turning ruins into bustling centers of commerce. New factories rose on the foundations of old ones, and people returned to the rhythm of daily life. Families rebuilt homes, reopened schools, and restored cultural traditions. For many, this period symbolized resilience and rebirth. Germany's transformation was particularly striking. West Germany emerged as an economic powerhouse. Its rapid revival, known as the Wirtschaftswunder or economic miracle, industries modernized, exports increased, and the nation became central to European cooperation. Meanwhile, East Germany remained under Soviet influence, shaping its society with strict controls and limited freedoms. Although divided, the two German states steadily grew, each representing a different response to the destruction left by the Axis. Japan also experienced extraordinary growth. The U.S. occupation brought reforms that strengthened democracy and encouraged innovation. Japanese industries embraced new technologies, leading to advancements in electronics, automobiles, and manufacturing. Cities that once lay in ruins transformed into centers of modern architecture and engineering. Within a generation, Japan rose from defeat to become one of the world's leading economies, proving that even nations crushed by war could rebuild with determination and vision. Socially, the war had a deep effect on attitudes and values. People across the world recognized the importance of peace and the dangers of unchecked power. War veterans returned home with experiences that shaped future generations. In countries such as the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, as the 1950s unfolded, the shadow of the Axis still stretched across the world, shaping nations, alliances, and identities. The war had ended, but its consequences continued to mold global events in ways both visible and hidden. Part 14 explores how the world confronted memory, justice, and the challenges of rebuilding humanity's conscience after the fall of the Axis. One of the most important tasks of the post-war era was confronting the crimes committed during the conflict. The Nuremberg trials had set a precedent, but justice extended far beyond the courtroom. Across Europe, smaller tribunals dealt with collaborators, soldiers, and officials who had played various roles in the Axis war machine. Many faced prison or execution, while others disappeared into new lives, trying to escape their past. In Japan, the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal held leaders accountable for atrocities committed across Asia. For many nations, these trials were not just about punishment, they were about healing wounds, restoring dignity, and ensuring that history would not be forgotten. The horrors revealed after the war pushed the world to demand stronger protections for ordinary people. The Geneva Conventions were expanded, adding new rules for the treatment of prisoners, civilians, and the wounded. International organizations grew in power and influence. The United Nations worked to resolve conflicts, provide humanitarian aid, and rebuild trust among countries shattered by Axis aggression. Though conflicts still arose, humanity now had a framework to prevent the kind of global disaster that the Axis had unleashed. Culturally, societies began to reflect deeply on the meaning of the war. Books, speeches, and films explored the brutality, sacrifice, and resilience of those who lived through the conflict. In Germany and Japan, a profound cultural transformation took place. Both nations looked inward, questioning how extremist ideologies had taken root and how they could prevent such paths in the future. Education systems were rewritten to promote democracy, critical thinking, and peace. Monuments and memorials were built in cities across the former Axis powers, not to glorify, but to mourn and warn future generations. Meanwhile, new political forces emerged from the ashes of war. In Italy, the fall of Mussolini led to the birth of a republic. Citizens voted to abolish the monarchy, rejecting the system that had enabled fascism. Italy rebuilt itself through industry, trade, and alliances with democratic nations. Its shift from dictatorship to democracy became one of the clearest examples of political rebirth after the Axis collapse. In Asia, countries that had suffered under Japanese occupation began rising to reclaim their independence. Korea, once divided by Japanese rule, now found itself split between Soviet and American influence, setting the stage for future. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, the world had entered a new era, one shaped directly by the fall of the Axis, yet defined by the ambitions and fears of the emerging superpowers. The collapse of Germany, Italy, and Japan had ended one kind of global conflict, but it set the stage for another, a struggle not of armies marching across continents, but of ideologies competing for the future of humanity. Part 15 explores how the legacy of the Axis continued to influence world events decades after their defeat. The division of Germany remained one of the clearest symbols of the post-war world. In West Germany, the democratic government embraced growth, modernity, and integration with Western Europe. Cities rebuilt from ruins transformed into hubs of industry and innovation. In East Germany, the Soviet-backed regime tightened its control, restricting freedoms and suppressing dissent. Tensions rose as thousands of East Germans fled to the West in search of better lives. In 1961, to stop this mass exodus, the East German government, supported by the Soviet Union, constructed the Berlin Wall for the world. The wall became a physical reminder of the ideological divide created after the fall of the Axis, a line separating freedom from oppression, democracy from dictatorship. Japan continued its remarkable post-war rise during this period, guided by new democratic institutions and supported by economic partnerships with the United States. Japan rapidly became a global center for technology, manufacturing, and culture. The transformation was astonishing. A nation once feared for militarism now symbolized peace, innovation, and discipline. Japanese cars, electronics, and industrial machinery reached markets around the world, earning Japan a reputation as an economic giant. Despite the trauma of war, the country rebuilt its identity around progress and cooperation, distancing itself from the policies that had once led to destruction. Italy also embraced renewal. The fall of Mussolini had left the nation in political and economic chaos, but the Italians rebuilt their democracy with determination. The 1950s and 1962 saw Italy enter a period known as the Italian economic miracle. Factories expanded, highways were built, and art, fashion, and cinema flourished. Italy became a founding member of the European Economic Community, the early version of the European Union, signaling its commitment to peace and unity. After the disasters of fascism across the world, the fall of the Axis had given birth to global institutions that were now gaining strength. The United Nations expanded its role, launching peacekeeping missions, handling humanitarian crises, and providing a platform for dialogue. Nations devastated by war joined international treaties that promoted cooperation instead of conquest. The idea that global problems required global solutions began to take root. As the world moved deeper into the second half of the 20th century, the echoes of the Axis collapse continued to shape global politics, society, and identity. Although decades had passed since the guns of World War II fell silent, the consequences of the conflict still influenced decisions made by nations across the world. Part 16 explores how the lessons of the war guided humanity through new challenges, new alliances, and new understandings of power and peace. By the 1970s, the two Germanys, East and West, stood as powerful symbols of what the fall of the Axis had created. West Germany had become one of Europe's strongest economies, a leading force in trade, engineering, and diplomacy. Its cities were modern, its industries advanced, and its people enjoyed freedoms unimaginable during the Nazi era. East Germany, however, remained tightly controlled by the Soviet Union. The Berlin Wall continued to divide families, dreams, and futures. Every attempt to escape, east to west, became a reminder of the ideological divide created in the ruins of post-war Europe. Yet even in this division, the world saw how nations forged new identities from the ashes of Hitler's regime. Japan's transformation continued with extraordinary momentum. By the 1970s and 1980 seconds, it had become a technological powerhouse. Innovations in electronics, automobiles, robotics, and engineering made Japan a global leader. Tokyo rose as a symbol of modernity, bright, fast, and forward-looking. The peaceful constitution written after the war continued to guide the nation, allowing Japan to focus its energy on progress instead of militarism. The country's soft power spread worldwide through film, art, technology, and culture. This new identity stood in sharp contrast to Japan's militaristic past, proving how deeply a nation can change after the fall of the Axis. Italy also strengthened its democracy. After the fall of Mussolini, Italy embraced cultural growth and political reform. By the late 20th century, Italian fashion, cinema, design, and automobiles gained global fame. Cities like Milan, Rome, and Florence thrived as centers of creativity and history. Italy had once been part of a destructive alliance, but now stood as an example of a modern democratic state contributing to peace and European unity. Globally, the institutions created after the war continued to grow. The United Nations became a critical platform for resolving conflicts and promoting cooperation. Peacekeeping missions were launched in regions around the world, reflecting the belief that international unity was essential to prevent another global war like the one sparked by the Axis powers. The European Economic Community evolved into the European Union, bringing closer ties between nations that had once fought each other brutally. Former enemies became partners, proving that peace could grow even from the darkest histories.